Hello and welcome to The Passion Show. My name is Phil and joining me as always is my co-host Kyle.
Hello.
And we also have returning guest Samir.
Thank you for having me back. It's all my pleasure. Pleasure's all mine.
Brilliant.
Thank
Love
you.
it.
So in today's episode, we're talking about samurai movies.
It's a very niche genre, isn't it? So I think it's good that we've got Samir on because he knows it like the back of his hand.
I do.
So hopefully we can learn some things. What would you say is like the proper entry point for it?
Well, I think probably the most mainstream example that we all probably know is Kill Bill. And, that's probably one of the most accessible versions of a samurai film. But then when you start looking into kind of where that film came from, the roots that are kind of there are, to me, what are the greatest cinema duo in history, which is Akira Kurosawa and Toshiro Mifune. I think they are, with all due respect to Scorsese and De Niro, I think they are the goats of the cinema duo. And they've got a ton of samurai films together that you can work through. I think in terms of just the flat out samurai film, which I think kind of, it was kind of remodeled as westerns, the Dollars trilogy for the Clint Eastwood films, they were kind of come from this.
Sergio Leone.
Yeah, and especially the Man with No Name trilogy, that one as well. So the story of Yojimbo, it's just really simple, and it was kind of the format of what a lot of samurai films were, which is just this ronin, which is a samurai without a master. The film starts, and you kind of get a good sense of how some of these samurais lived, and I think it's super interesting. So the film starts, he's just walking down a dusty path. He comes to like a crossroads. He kind of comes to a forked path and he doesn't know which way to go. So he gets a stick, throws it up in the air, and whichever way the stick lands, he goes. And just from that, you get a sense of direction of like where this guy's at. Like he doesn't really care where he goes. He's just there for the journey.
When you're getting into like foreign film, it can seem quite daunting, but the way you talk about samurai films is they seem quite sort of simplistic.
Really
in
simplistic,
fact.
yeah. And I think especially the case with Akira Kurosawa films is that his brother, in Japan in the early 1900s, they would show silent films, but they would also have someone to the side of the screen, and they would basically narrate what's going on with theatre. So they kind of do like a theatrical performance. So when you watch Akira Kurosawa films, it's never really like elaborate camera movement or crazy editing. It's always pretty to the point. And the acting in it is always what stands out as well, because Akira Kurosawa's kind of come from his theatrical background, is a lot of the characters are, you can just look at them and kind of tell what they're thinking. Obviously modern cinema is, it's all in the eyes and it's kind of more moody and stuff. But it's kind of exaggerated in a lot of these samurai films. So if a character's laughing, he'll literally like throw his head back and hold his belly. And if someone's crying, he's literally like, ooh, like you can see him scrunching up his face. And so it's really heightened emotions, which definitely helps, because especially like I said, foreign films can be daunting, but you just kind of, even if you struggling to keep up with the subtitles or whatever it may be, the story's always pretty simple to follow, and you can always kind of tell what's going on. And that's why I think, because a lot of these samurai films, they're just really clear storytelling and really vivid storytelling, which is kind of almost in a way that's unlike a lot of other films.
So would you say within samurai films, storytelling and like acting takes precedent? Like they're like the main focus points.
I think storytelling, acting, and then just the overall, because I keep going back to like Yojimbo and Seven Samurai, but I think I was watching an interview with Oliver Stone, who kind of produced a ton of stuff, and he was saying that when you see a Akira Kurosawa film, it's literally kind of like seeing what you imagine what seeing Beethoven would have been like, because it's just this full symphony. It's just everything kind of working hand in hand. It's just everything kind of lining up to make this one coherent thing, in a way that's kind of unlike any other kind of genre of film, I think, because it really balances, because like we said, it's never elaborate camera work, lighting, anything like that. It's always really simple and really focused, to the point where in Yojimbo there's a shot where they got the standoff moment, and they would get these huge industrial fans and they would just blow dust and smoke and all this kind of stuff to kind of really, it's just things like that. And when you add over some of the scores that these guys had, it really just kind of is this vibrant kind of vivid thing just popping off the screen, I think.
That sounds gorgeous.
Yeah. So we were talking about briefly before, but a lot of we talk about movement and stuff, because we were saying how when you, as a Western audiences, when we read, we go left to right. So when we see a protagonist in a film, we see them going left to right, and we see that as a friendly thing. We kind of
It's also like a natural story progression, isn't it? Like you see them progressing as a character because they go forwards,
yeah,
and the villain goes backwards.
exactly.
Because
Yeah,
they're not in the right state of mind. So
exactly.
whatever.
Yeah, like the example is always Lawrence of Arabia. That film's like 11 hours long, and the whole film he's just moving one way. It's only ever left to right. You never see him moving right to left.
It's like Lord of the Rings as well, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. All the shots of them going, they're always left to right. You know, all the silhouettes on the mountains, all that kind of stuff. But then when it comes to Japanese cinema, and I think especially this era of samurai films, the way they read is obviously bottom to top, right to left. So they're not really held, and they don't really see this kind of way of if a character moves left to right, he's good. If a character moves right to left, he's bad. And again, that's not what we think. And we might subconsciously think
Yeah.
it, but it's not like, oh my god.
Is it jarring the first time you watch it?
I don't know if it's jarring, but it's definitely like, I think you, even if you don't know like that thing that I've just
Yeah.
kind of said, you probably pick up on it like, oh, there's something odd about the way this is moving. Like you might, and again, it might put people off, I don't know, but that you definitely realize that there's something different, and there's something, it's filmed through the lens of a way that I don't think the West will ever fully be able to recreate, just because of the cultural identity that kind of goes with it.
It's all about your subconscious, isn't it? Like,
Yeah.
they probably don't film it purposefully like that. They do it subconsciously because
Exactly.
that's just how they read stories.
Yeah, exactly.
And so do we.
Yeah, I don't think they're sat there being like, all right, we're going to have it go bomb, you know, all this
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
They're
Such
just
a
like,
tiny difference as well.
exactly. It's not a huge thing, and that's what I mean. You know, when you get, because like I was saying before, you know, when characters' emotions are always really clear to see, and some of the best stuff in Yojimbo as well, which is fantastic. The main character, who Yojimbo means bodyguard, and it's about this guy that kind of goes into town and he plays these two gangster crime lords against each other by pretending to be both of their bodyguards, but he's basically just rinsing them for money.
I thought it was about some bloke called Jimbo.
No, it's
I
not.
was just
Yo,
imagining,
Jimbo.
I was imagining Jimbo from The Simpsons with his little purple hat. And genuinely, that's what I think of every time.
Well, I think that would be a pretty good remake. Called Yo, Jimbo, with a little comma there.
There's probably a Simpsons parody in there somewhere, isn't
Oh,
there?
for sure. Well, there's actually another samurai film, Rashomon, which is
Yeah,
Kira
I've heard
Kurosawa
of
again.
this.
Yeah, that kind of became a term, especially in like film culture, was something would be a Rashomon, which is because the film Rashomon takes place from 4 different points of view. So it's like the woodcutter, the samurai, the princess, and the priest, or something like that. The film just kind of takes place from all 4 different perspectives, and the film never tells you what the answer is. You're kind of left to interpret it. And again, that's kind of a blueprint that's kind of being remodeled. That was really one of the first films with an open ending. You know, like you get a few films where it's kind of a mysterious ending, like Citizen Kane and the Rosebud thing. But Rashomon was really like, you choose completely. You choose this. And, you know, we see that even now with things like Inception and stuff, you know.
It sounds to me like it's a really sort of pioneering genre, but one that isn't talked about as much.
Yeah, definitely.
Because
So,
it seems like everyone goes back to like Star Wars and
Yeah.
stuff like that, but you forget, where did Star Wars come from?
well, I think this is the way I kind of discovered samurai films was through that, because I think for me, whenever I get really passionate and when I get really involved with something, I always want to know where it comes from. Like I'm
Yeah.
fascinated with the DNA of stuff and where it kind of comes from. So if there's a film I love, I'll watch all the interviews I can with that director and work out what inspired them to make that. So obviously, me being a huge fan of the original Star Wars trilogy, I wanted to find out where he kind of came with the ideas from. And obviously, there's a ton of stuff, but Hidden Fortress was one of the main inspirations for that, which is another Akira Kurosawa Toshiro Mifune samurai film.
I suppose if you're into your Star Wars, it is a good sort of entry point then, isn't it?
That's another one. That's another great entry point. Yeah, is that you can go back. You can watch a ton of interviews with George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, and all of them credit Akira Kurosawa as the greatest director that's ever lived. All 4 of them say he's the best to ever do it. And in fact, so much so that Ran, which is a 1985 film from Akira Kurosawa, kind of later on in his life, he was kind of less popping at this point, but so he couldn't get the funding for the film. It was this big epic King Lear adaptation, but he couldn't get the funding for it. So George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola put up the money for the film out of their own pocket to produce the film. They didn't take any cut of it. They just said, "This is for you," and they called him Sensei because obviously everything they learned, they taught, because everything they kind of learned from him, they call him Sensei. So Francis,
That's so wholesome. That,
it's
isn't
beautiful,
it?
isn't it? Yeah. So and they produced this whole film, and it wasn't a massive commercial success, but they both Lucas and Coppola said, like, if you have a chance to kind of help out the guy that's inspired you to do all this stuff, then do it.
I know Seven Samurai is always on the IMDb top 100. It's always on those lists of like the best movies of all time.
Always.
And I noticed you've got a Seven Samurai tattoo on your
I do.
forearm.
Which always I get lots of questions about what this is because I suppose it's quite a weird looking tattoo.
It looks like something from Arrival.
Yeah, I get Arrival a lot. I used to work at a Premier Inn back in Nottingham, and one girl thought they were coffee cup stains. And I was like, yeah, sure, I'll take that.
Little tiny coffee cups.
Yeah, but then, because I was working at Premier Inn when I first got it done, so everyone was asking about it. And I got so bored of just, because this is how the conversation went every time. It would be, oh, so what's that tattoo? I was like, oh, it's a Japanese film called Seven Samurai. And they'd be like, oh, I've seen that one. And I'd be like, have you? Like the 50s 3.5 hour long Japanese film, you see that? And they're like, yeah, the one with Tom Cruise. I'm like, if you think I've got the Last Samurai tattoo, I'm about to fucking slap you, man.
Because that tattoo causes so much like annoyance from people loving The Last Samurai.
Yeah, literally. People think I've got a Tom Cruise samurai, man. I'm not even that. I think I'm some crazy Scientologist. So I started coming up with different answers. When I was working at Premier Inn, a customer was like, what is that? What does it mean? And I told them that I got kidnapped by Indonesian criminals, and they put it on me as like their thing, and they're like, oh my God. Seven Samurai, it's always on the lists. For my liking, it should be number one on all the lists ever. But again, like we were saying before, it's a daunting task. It's a daunting film to kind of put ahead of you. It's over 3 hours. It's got an intermission. It's that old school. And it's a foreign film, so yeah, you've got to pay attention.
You've got subtitles, haven't you?
Subtitles as well. But then this is the thing. I really think we're talking about, these Japanese films and these samurai films not getting the credit they deserve. I think if any doesn't get the credit it deserves, it's Seven Samurai.
Yeah.
We wouldn't be living in this superhero boom, this kind of blockbuster age, were it not for Seven Samurai. They were they really put together this blueprint of a lot of comic books, even comic books at the time. For sure, they had team ups and stuff, but Seven Samurai was 1954. That's when that came out. In fact, Seven Samurai and the original Godzilla film came out in the same year.
It's a great year.
Both by the same studio, Toho Studios.
Wow.
And during the production of both of these, they almost went broke because the production was so expensive of these two films. But then luckily, both the films were a huge hit and they made all their money back and then some. But yeah, so with Seven Samurai, for sure you had team-up comics, but a lot of the team-up comics and the superheroes and stuff, they didn't really come around until the 60s. X-Men was in the 60s, Avengers was in the 60s, a lot of Justice League was kind of creeping in the 50s, but mostly took off in the 60s. And I think partly, in fact, due to like Seven Samurai really laid this blueprint of this is how you get these down-and-out heroes, bring them all together, and have one last hurrah where they defend the people.
It's like Star Wars, isn't it?
Exactly,
it's just like what we said before.
Yeah.
You got like your character types and stuff like
exactly.
that.
And when you look at the Seven Samurai, it's literally you get the blueprint for every team up film. Like you've got your Captain America and you've got your fast talking, your quick-witted Iron Man, and you have all this. They have all the archetypes that mirror through today. So yeah, for sure, I don't think it gets some credit it deserves. But then when you look at Seven Samurai, especially if even if you know like a tiny bit about film kind of technical stuff like cinematography or editing, when you look at Seven Samurai, for me, the thing that always stands out is like, wow, this is so ahead of its time. Some of the stuff it does in editing is, they have this shot where one of the master, he's called Kyozo, he's like the master swordsman, he's like the best technical swordsman. He's running through this field, and they do this really crazy thing where they're like layered images on top of him running. So it's kind of like they like project images on top of himself, like layer the images. So it makes it look like he's running like 3 or 4 times faster than he actually is.
I love
it's so intelligent
to me.
It's crazy. And then they use that same technique for Naruto, the anime where he kind of running with his arms behind his back. They use that same technique with the animation cells. So and that was like 10 years ago. So it's a technique and style used from the 50s is still being used.
It's probably still ahead of its time, isn't it?
It still is, for sure. And
does it still hold up, like, obviously?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it looks stunning. Like, it just looks like a black and white film that was kind of made now. Because Akira Kurosawa, because I'm a huge fan. I've read his biography and all kinds of stuff. I'm obsessed with the guy. But he sounds like an absolute drill master to work for. Like, he was such a perfectionist. Like, you hear stories about Kubrick and those guys.
I was going to say
but,
Kubrick.
like, man, when you hear about Akira Kurosawa, it's insane. Like, it sounds like he ran his set somewhat like a dictatorship.
Really?
Why? What did he get people to do?
Well, it's just, he was kind of known for doing repeated, like, an insane amount of takes. And the kind of thing that a lot of cinematographers had a hard time working with him because he always demanded shooting on telescopic lenses, so like these 100mm lenses, which are, if anyone's ever tried to use a lens bigger than like 75mm, you realize that it can be a huge pain, and to focus on one thing is kind of crazy. And like we mentioned earlier, a lot of these films are so movement based, and a lot of the characters and action are so movement based. To have these huge lenses to try and keep on where the action is, it takes like a wizard to kind of operate a camera like that. And obviously, if you weren't up to scratch, then you were out. But again, this is like Kubrick. If you get someone they have the vision, and this is what it is. When it comes through, it comes through. And like we were saying, this is why I really think Seven Samurai doesn't get the credit it deserves today. It's still ahead of its time for sure.
So one thing we haven't actually talked about, considering it's a samurai episode, is the actual action within the films. Like, would you say that like they're predominantly action all the way through, or is it quite like a slow burn and then one big sort of explosive scene at the end?
I would say most of them are slow burns.
Are they?
Most of them are very slow burns, and most of them are
is that action scene something that you're always waiting for, like a really epic like fight?
I always go back to Yojimbo. I always go back to it because I think Seven Samurai is probably the greatest film ever made, but I think Yojimbo is very tight and I think it's a perfect example of what a samurai film is.
Would you say that's like a really good like entry point to Yojimbo?
Yeah. That was apart from Hidden Fortress, that was the first samurai film I saw, and that was a film that made me realize I was like, whoa, there's something in samurai films. This is definitely something that I need to check out. So Yojimbo, I think, is always a great gateway one for sure.
And that can lead you sort of down the rabbit hole of Kurosawa, and then
that leads to, because Yojimbo has a sequel called Sanjuro, so there's two there that are great. Yojimbo's like I kind of briefly mentioned what it's about. Sanjuro's it follows the same character, but it's more of a comedy. Like, it's more lighthearted, and he's got 6 or 7 disciples that he's kind of training to be like him. So it's a lot more goofy, and it's a lot more fun in like a charming way. But yeah, once you find Yojimbo and Sanjuro, there's a whole rabbit hole that you'll get.
Yeah, is there any sort of like other directors that are like really influential in the genre?
I think the other, apart from in terms of samurai films, the other biggest one is Masaki Kobayashi, who he's mostly known for like his horror films, his Japanese horror films. Like, he did a film called Kwaidan, which is like it's like 4 sections. It's like sectional films, and they're all basically tell a horror story from Japanese fairy tale. But he did a film called Harakiri, which is often cited as one of the greatest Japanese films ever, not just samurai films. And it's just that's another one where it just kind of encompasses every different aspect of cinema you can think of. So Masaki Kobayashi's up there for sure. Yoji Yamada, he's more of like a recent guy. He did a film called The Twilight Samurai, which is very, very slow burn. That's basically a drama. Like, there's probably only less than 10 minutes of action in it, and it's like 2.5 hours long. So it's very, very... but then again, another modern one was Blade of the Immortal, which came out, I want to say like 2017.
I was about to ask, is it still a franchise? Is it still a genre that's alive today?
I think it is to an extent, but what you kind of find is it's more just like manga adaptations now. You get a lot of manga and anime samurai stories. So a lot of the films they're kind of doing, they're kind of remakes of the anime and manga. Whereas obviously back in the day, the golden age of Japanese cinema, it was original scripts, and it was, in fact, Akira Kurosawa and Masaki Kobayashi, they kind of worked together, and they had this technique of how they would write the action scenes. And the action scenes, they would just kind of say, they would look at each other's scripts, and they would try and work out why the action scenes went on as long as they did, and they're like, well, that wouldn't make sense, it would end sooner than that. So they were really conscious of trying to trim down the action into this really necessary thing.
I found what you've been saying is like really fascinating. Like, it's inspired me to like go out and watch some samurai films. So if you were to give me a handful of movies to watch, what is this handful?
Okay, I don't, obviously Seven Samurai is always up there, but it's rare that I recommend that, because again, it's such a commitment. And I was
about to say, it's a big watch. Like, I know there's films that I love, and I'm like, I can't in the right heart recommend it to someone, because I know they might even be bored.
Exactly.
But I'm like, you just need to like take the time to watch this, but because I know what you mean.
Yeah. So
especially as an entry level film.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
so I think Seven Samurai might be best off once you've seen a few other samurai films, and if you're mentally prepared for it, then do it. And I promise, if you're willing to meet the film on its terms, your life will be changed forever, for sure. But the few I'd recommend that are kind of like pretty good entry levels and summarize really well what a samurai movie can do well.
So get your pens and paper ready.
If you're interested.
interested.
Yeah. So Yojimbo, like I've mentioned before. I think it's a perfect entry point. And check out Sandro as well, which is the sequel to it. This is on BFI Player, all on BFI. You can get a free trial on it for like 2 weeks. So smash them all out in like 2 weeks.
If you want to sponsor us, BFI Player, feel free, slide into our DMs.
Yeah, do it. So Yojimbo, Sandro, I do recommend. Again, they're quite long films, but they're just kind of these crazy cool epics. So his two Samurai Macbeth adaptations, which is Throne of Blood, which is the Macbeth adaptation, and Ran, which is the King Lear one, which we just talked about with George Lucas and Coppola sponsoring it.
I'd be interested to see that.
Yeah.
Like to see
and that has some of his most beautiful cinematography, because it was funded by, George Lucas had all that Star Wars money, so he was ready to build some crazy sets. So there is some really elaborate set pieces in that as well.
If he was getting money off George Lucas, he was getting money off George Lucas. And he was using it.
Yeah, for sure. Like, this is 85, so the original trilogy's been and gone, and he's already made all his money from, like, doll sales and shit, hasn't he? So the other one is Harikiri. That's one I mentioned before, Masaki Kobayashi. That one's it's a slow burn, but again, if you stick with it, and it takes lots and lots of twists and turns.
I think that'll wrap it up for this week. So thank you to Kyle for being my co-host.
Thank you, Phil.
Thanks to Samir for coming on the podcast to talk about samurai films.
Thank you very much. I look forward to being back again one day.
If you have any passions yourself, feel free to leave them in the comments.
Hit us up.
Yeah, we'd love to have you on the podcast to talk about your passion. But other than that, thanks for listening, and
have a great day.
Yeah, see you next week.
Farewell.
Bye.